Okay, cool. So what I want to do for the second half is, I want to talk about the other major kind of option here, right? And let me stress, with regards to direct reference theory, there's a lot of nuance, right? There's a lot of ways we can kind of tweak it or modify it, some things to say back to the arguments. I just want to make sure that we get the kind of basic theory, the core of it, and the core problems. So what we're going to do for the second half here is talk about, again, the kind of big alternative. And we're going to paint it with a very broad brush. There's a lot of nuance here. This is descriptivism. So our plan is to present descriptivism, the core of the theory, kind of motivate it a little bit, say how it responds to the puzzles that we talked about for the direct reference theory, and then finally conclude by raising puzzles for it. Right? It'll be fun. So, in light of the problems facing direct reference theory, Millianism, we might instead think that singular terms are more than just tags. That is, we might think that the meaning of a singular term is more than just its mere referent. That was certainly the conclusion from the puzzles, right? And you might also think that reference or references, the notation, is going to be secured by more than just this kind of tagging. In fact, these again are going to go nicely hand in hand. And descriptivism gives us an answer to the two questions, right? So singular terms, according to the descriptivist, either are or they encode descriptions. I'm going to talk about encoding because this captures the is. It's just an easier way to talk, right? So the meaning of a singular term, according to the descriptivist, is the encoded description. So the meaning isn't the object denoted or referred to, it's the description that gets you there. The meaning is the encoded description. And then how does reference work? Well, reference works because the referent, the thing picked out, satisfies the encoded description. So we use what we're saying is the meaning to then also help us figure out how reference actually occurs.
What do you mean exactly by encode?
Good. So the thought here is basically like, go back to Gerald. Right? Remember the weird singular term Gerald. If Gerald functions as a name, what it really is there's inside it a kind of description. The weird thing that was in the picture that's from Nathan's Nightmares, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So there's, kind of packed inside the singular term, some kind of description.
Okay, so it is already encoded. There's nobody that encodes it.
So again, we're not really saying exactly what's the kind of sociological or historical process that builds the kind of description into the term. That's for linguists to figure out. But the way it functions, the meaning, is that there is this code, this description kind of baked in. That's the idea. Cool. So, this is descriptivism. Again, there's lots of nuance to the position, but this is really the core. The meanings of singular terms are descriptions, and reference works by things satisfying the specific description. So, if nothing or more than one thing satisfies the description, then the singular term is meaningful. It expresses the encoded description, but it's empty. It doesn't singularly refer. It's great. That's already something that DTR couldn't do. The direct reference theory couldn't, DRT couldn't do. So let's talk a little bit more about the details here. So descriptivists agree about those two basic points. They disagree about how exactly in the nature of these descriptions, how they're encoded, what they are. Frege, who's a very famous descriptivist, thought that singular terms express senses, and that these senses in turn determine reference. We're not really going to talk about this. This is something that's going to come up in what I think you do, history of analytic philosophy. Sandra's going to talk to you about this. Russell thought literally semantically, syntactically, proper names are just encoded definite descriptions. For our purposes, for our discussion, we're going to focus on the Russellian version just because then we don't have to talk about the kind of metaphysics of senses, anything like this. It's worth noting that something like this broad Russellian view was, honest to God, the received view about the meanings and mechanisms of singular terms up until the 1960s and 70s. So let's figure out, how does Russell kind of motivate it? Well, he starts off by examining indefinite descriptions. So he looks at a man, or a university. We're going to talk about a man. This was his example. So how does an indefinite description like a man work? Well, the first thing that Russell says is, note that this is not a proposition on its own. If anything, it's something more like a predicate. It needs a kind of thing to fill in. It's a proto-proposition. Who is a man? The table? No. The person who's going to be prime minister? Maybe. We'll find out later. But what we have with an indefinite description is a kind of gappy thing. It's basically like saying, is a man. We need to fill in the singular term. And you can fill this in various ways. You could fill it with individual names. So fill it in with little a, fill it in with Shaq, fill it in with LeBron, fill it in with Nathan, fill it in with Tilburg University. Or you can fill it in with propositional functions. That is, some, all, every, none, no one. The kinds of things we can express with our quantifiers. Everything is a man. Well, that's not true, but at least it's meaningful. It says something. No one is a man. Again, not true, but meaningful. So indefinite descriptions then are proto-propositions. We give meaning by filling them in with various singular terms. And often we do this with propositional functions, quantifier phrases. So this is, yes, please.
Yeah, I don't know if it's, what if it is a man said?
Good. So note, how would we think about that, right? Well, we would treat that as, actually to say a man said, it's already a propositional function. There is something that's a man, and it said, right? In this way, we're already buying into something like the Russellian story. A man isn't a referring phrase. At best, it's just a way for us to talk about quantificational functions, quantifiers. It's not a singular term. That's the idea. So, okay, cool. So indefinite descriptions are kind of proto-propositions that we can add more stuff to get complete sentences. Well, what about definite descriptions? We know how to do definite descriptions. We did this, right? We did this in weeks 5 and 6. Russell's example is, the author of Waverley is Scottish. Well, how would we understand that? Russell says we read this as implying that he uses a very unhelpful way. He talks about it's never not false or it's sometimes true. This is just another way to say, right, at least one thing in the domain wrote Waverley. At most one thing in the domain wrote Waverley. And whoever wrote Waverley, that thing is Scottish. He expresses this in a very unhelpfully complicated way, but this is the core of what he's after. And as soon as we start to read it this way, with its quantifier phrases very explicit, we know how to treat the sentence. We know how to treat the sentence. There's at least one thing that's a Waverley author. There's at most one thing that's a Waverley author. And there's something that's a Waverley author and is Scottish. And of course, right, we did this, right? We did this. So the Russellian view is that names, proper names, are basically these. We're just going to read them, unpack them as definite descriptions. Nathan is Californian. There's at least one thing that Nathanizes. There's at most one thing that Nathanizes. And the thing that Nathanizes is Californian. Tilburg University is the 7th biggest city in the Netherlands. There's at least one thing that Tilburgs. There's at most one thing that Tilburgs. Not at all. I say Tilburg University, I meant Tilburg City. Every time that we think we have a proper name, it's really just a way to express the concealed, encoded, definite description.
So for us, or what do we have to proceed these definite descriptions?
Yeah, right. So whenever you think you have a proper name, what you really have is lurking in the background a definite description. And that's the meaning of the term, and satisfying that description, that's how the object becomes the thing referred to.
And so
Please.
And in the case of the in the case of indefinite one, that wasn't. I mean,
In those cases, right, it's not a definite description.
because we don't have Satya, Man, and Nathan.
Exactly. Right? Exactly. So, again, this idea, anti-burn on, interesting. So this idea, right, the meaning of this proper name is going to be understood as the concealed definite description. And then how it hooks up with the object is by the object satisfying that description. This is how we can explain away or avoid the puzzles from earlier. Right? So let's go through them one by one. Take the apparent reference or apparent meaningfulness with empty names. Well, cool, that's no problem. Whenever you have an empty name, you don't have to worry about what its referent is. It's meaningful because it has the encoded description. Right? So we just say, okay, take Odysseus was Greek, Oedipus was Greek, right? Charlie's a unicorn, Santa wears a red suit, whatever name you want. Right? That proper name, you unpack, you read it as there is something that satisfies the description, there's at most one thing that satisfies the description, and then whatever predicate you want. And it's meaningful. It's meaningful, right? We can express it something like this. This says there's at least one thing that Odysseizes, at most one thing that Odysseizes, and that thing is Greek. And note, this could be unpacked. This might turn out to be a hell of a lot of other predicates too, but that's not really a problem for the general structure. And this claim is meaningful. It's also false. Why is it false? Well, because it isn't the case that there's at least one thing that satisfies the description. Bang. We did exactly what the DRT couldn't do. Say why it's meaningful and also why it has the truth value it does. That's cool. The same thing with negative existentials. We can actually explain this away. We don't have to use a proper name. Instead, we just say it's not the case that there's something that satisfies the definite description. Negative existentials can be meaningful and true, which is good. That's a huge up compared to what we had before. So we can satisfy the two problems with empty names because we can talk about things having meaning despite the fact that they lack reference. Cool? With me so far? So, 2 out of the 4 done. How about the other 2? The other 2 are just as easily dealt with. Frege's puzzle. Remember, Frege's puzzle was how can some identity claims be meaningful, be cognitively significant? Well, Russell has an answer, or descriptivists have an answer. There's different descriptions on the 2 sides. And learning that something satisfies 2 different definite descriptions, well, that's news.
It's Frege not himself. Could Frege not answer that himself?
Yes. So I mean, he was also a descriptivist. Basically, he's going to say something very similar to this. Like, why are some of these identity claims informative? Because there's different descriptions on each side. But the people he was pushing against, they don't have that. Because direct reference theory doesn't say the singular terms encode descriptions. They just say the meaning just is the reference. Here we have something in the way. The meaning is the description, and satisfying the description is how reference works. And similarly with our intentional substitution puzzle, right? What is it that Lois believes? It's different in the two cases. Because when you substitute Superman for Clark, you're literally plugging in something that means something different. Because it means the description. Whatever exactly the description is, we're not entirely sure. Yeah.
But the things they refer to, or that they pick out, aren't necessarily entirely described by the different descriptions, right?
Yeah.
So
one of the issues here is it might be hard to know exactly what's in the content of a description. Right? It might be that the description encoded and the description that you think is encoded are different. And in fact, this is going to be one of the problems with the view. But again, at least prima facie, it has a story to tell to deal with the four problems with the first guys. Right? Empty names, cool, they can be meaningful, even though they're empty. And as long as we have that difference, we can deal with the two problems. Right? Similarly, our substitution cases can be explained away because the meanings are different. Meaning isn't just reference. Okay. Things are looking pretty good for our descriptivist. So, of course, what we have to do now is let's burn it to the fucking ground, right? So here's a kind of rough and ready summary, right? The commitments of descriptivism. Some of them are a little strong, but I think we can kind of buy it, right? So first, for every singular term X, there's a cluster of properties, the phi's. These are the things that we're going to kind of talk about as the properties that are satisfied in the description. Wears a red suit, lives at the North Pole, distributes presents, blah, blah, blah. Second, an entity is the referent of that singular term if and only if said entity is the only thing that satisfies the cluster of properties. Basically, right, it refers to the object if the object is the thing that satisfies the description. Cool. Here's where we get to something substantive. Speakers who correctly use the term believe that some subset of this cluster picks out a unique individual. If you use the singular term, then you have some beliefs about the content of the description, and those properties that you're using damn well better be in the actual description. Otherwise, you're totally misfiring. If you think that Santa Claus wears a yellow suit and lives at the South Pole and things like this, you're misusing Santa Claus. You need to know at least some of the properties in the description. Similarly, here's two big ones. If X exists, then X has the phi's, is known a priori. Everyone know what we mean by a priori? This has come up in other classes. Right? A priori, a posteriori, the contrast here. So you know this sentence is true without having to do any empirical investigation. Why? Because the meaning of the singular term is the thing that satisfies the description. If X exists, X has the phi's, that is trivial. Because that's basically saying the thing that satisfies the phi's satisfies the phi's. The meaning of the singular term just is to be satisfy the description. So this is just another way to say the thing that satisfies the description satisfies the description. That shouldn't be interesting. And similarly, if X exists, then X has the phi's is a necessary truth. Because the meaning of X is just the thing that has these properties. the thing that satisfies the descriptions. So there's no room for this to turn out to be possibly false. It's going to turn out that 3, 4, and 5 are all false. These are the core commitments of descriptivism. There are puzzles that attack them. Okay, so let's talk through the puzzles that attack them. These are all puzzles developed by Saul Kripke in the kind of late 60s and introduced in the early 70s. So here's our first puzzle for descriptivism. It's called the knowledge argument. Consider Joe. So, does anyone know who this is? It's fine, right? It's usually fine. So, consider Joe, who only knows that Feynman is a famous physicist. Doesn't know anything else about him, he just knows that Feynman is a famous physicist. Notably, Joe doesn't believe that his description of famous physicist picks out anyone uniquely. Because Joe's also happy to say, like, oh, Einstein's a famous physicist. Schrodinger's a famous physicist. That said, Joe can still say that Feynman picks out this dude. Feynman picks out Feynman. Why is that a problem? Well, for Joe, Feynman is a meaningful singular term, even though he doesn't believe there's any specific description that this guy satisfies. Joe can use the name. But he does not believe that there's some set of the properties that that object uniquely satisfies.
Would you think that the famous physicist Feynman would...
Good. So this is why we have this kind of thing, right? We have a restriction that it can't just be like, oh, is named Socrates or is named Feynman.
Why not?
Because then what you have to do is have reference in order to get the description going to pick out the reference.
His last name is Feynman, so you could just say...
That's also not going to be definite, right? There might be multiple Feynmans who are famous physicists. This is the problem.
Yeah.
So again, this is the kind of thing. As there are cases where we can use singular terms and still not believe that any associated description is definite.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
the problem here is that something is that Feynman is a famous physicist. Doesn't like it's true that Feynman is a famous physicist, but the problem is that he's not the unique one or the unique subject that fills famous physicists. Okay.
So Joe, in this case, right, knows how to use the singular term, and he can use it successfully to pick out this man, but he does not believe in any kind of collection of properties that this man uniquely satisfies. That's the problem. We can also do this with something like Aristotle. Right? A lot of us might not know exactly that much about Aristotle, but we know that he's an ancient Greek philosopher. Cool, but an ancient Greek philosopher, yeah. So we need to have some kind of distinctive, definite content. And it looks like you can use a term even without an associated definite content. Distinctive, yeah.
But then Joe doesn't actually know Feynman. Because if he only knows that there's a famous physicist that's named Richard Feynman, and he's sure that there might be other famous physicists that are also named Feynman.
Yes.
Couldn't we just solve this by saying Joe doesn't actually pick out this
Good.
Richard Feynman?
But he can still say things like Feynman is a famous physicist.
But he doesn't know which Feynman he's talking about.
Doesn't
I
matter.
wouldn't say that the table is brown.
He can still use the name in a meaningful way. This is the catch, right? It seems like he can still enter into otherwise, you'll have a hell of a time ever teaching Joe who Feynman is. Okay? So, the dude we were talking about yesterday, the famous physicist, he's based in Princeton or based in Caltech and does all of these things. In order for that to work, Joe already has to have a way to pick Feynman out. Do you see the trick there? To hang the propositions onto the right object, he has to know the meaning of Feynman already. So he has to be able to use that meaningfully to pick the object out before even the descriptions get attached. If he can learn the description. That's basically what this is also predicated on. So there's another hand, I think, I caught in the corner. Okay? So here's our first case. We can meaningfully use these singular terms without knowing the associated definite description. In fact, denying knowledge of any definite element. So there's the first one. I've ordered these in kind of weakest to strongest. Here's our second objection. It's the modal argument. So I've got a quote from Kripke. It's not, in any intuitive sense of necessity, a necessary truth that Aristotle had the properties commonly attributed to him. So let's unpack this. Here's sentence A. If Aristotle exists, then Aristotle has most of the following features: teaching Alexander the Great, being a student of Plato, being a philosopher, being Greek, etc., etc., etc. Take the properties that you think are in the definite description encoded in Aristotle. It's not necessary that Aristotle satisfies those descriptions. Suppose Aristotle is born and dies in very early age. He doesn't teach Alexander. He's never a student of Plato. He's not a philosopher. Maybe if historical facts go differently, he's not even Greek.
But is that because it's kind of subjective?
So not because it's subjective. Remember, this is dealing with the alethic modalities. There's a possible situation where we have Aristotle, but he's just got a whole bunch of different properties. Maybe very early in his youth, he gets called up to military service, gets maimed, and then goes on to live a life as a fisherman in a lonely island. Still Aristotle. Doesn't satisfy these descriptive properties. But it's still Aristotle. So the problem here is basically, given descriptivism, A, that conditional has to be a necessary truth. To go back a few slides, 5. But the problem is, he doesn't express a necessary truth. It seems possible, again, in some alethic sense of possible, that Aristotle does not satisfy the description that's encoded within Aristotle. But it does not make sense to say, possibly Aristotle is not Aristotle.
Can you rephrase that as something like you don't know sufficiently to identify Aristotle?
Good. So importantly, this is distinct from the previous one, right? The previous one is basically, you don't know enough to definitely pick out an object, that kind of epistemic argument. This isn't epistemic. This is, no. If we think about just genuine possibilities, the way things could have gone, it's possible, nothing to do with what we know, right? It's possible that this object that does in fact satisfy the description didn't. But then it's not, so here's a claim, right? Here's a claim that's possible. This is possibly true. Aristotle is not the phi, where phi is again that cluster of properties. But here is a sentence that cannot be false. Or sorry, it cannot be true. That sentence cannot be true. That doesn't make sense, because that's basically saying, and there's no way to make that make sense. Okay. So our first one is this epistemic problem. There doesn't seem to be, or at least with some speakers, there's no encoded definite content, but they can still meaningfully use the term. The second one is, it seems possible that an object could fail to satisfy the description, but we could still use the name to pick it out. Now our last one is hilarious, and it's beautiful. So I'm going to read you a long quote, and then we'll talk through it. Okay. Suppose that Gödel was not in fact the author of his famous theorem. Oh, sorry, yes.
I still don't understand why, if we know that Aristotle was a Greek philosopher and stuff, descriptivism goes with that refutes the descriptivism.
So the important thing here, so with the second objection here,
Yes.
it is that, right, this sentence, if descriptivism is correct, A, the sentence expressed by A, needs to be a necessary truth, right? If Aristotle exists, then he has to have the properties encoded. But it's possible to make the antecedent true and the consequent false. So let's take a world where Aristotle exists, but he dies very early, almost immediately after childbirth. He doesn't teach Alexander in that world. He's not a student of Plato. He's certainly not a philosopher. He doesn't do many of the things, in fact, probably any of the things that we're going to think are in the definite description. But he still exists. So this is why it's not a necessary truth anymore. And the difficulty for the view, again to go back, is on descriptivism, that kind of claim should be a necessary truth. Because the meaning of this singular term, the meaning of Aristotle, is the encoded description of that thing, right? So the fact that he is called Aristotle necessarily entails, he satisfies these properties. So there shouldn't be a gap like that. It shouldn't be possible for him to be Aristotle and to fail to satisfy the properties. Seems like it's possible. So much the worse for descriptivism. That's the second one, right? First one is, we might not know. The second one is, it seems there's a possibility gap. The third one, the most powerful, is that we could just get this whole thing wrong right off the bat. Does everyone know who Gödel is? The most important thing to know about Gödel is he proved the incompleteness of arithmetic.
Of a what?
Of arithmetic.
It's that mathematicians always have work.
Yes, it's a good thing for mathematicians. It doesn't matter. He's really famous for proving a theorem. That's all you need to know. He proved Gödel's theorem. Right? So, suppose that Gödel he wasn't in fact the author of this theorem. Instead, it was a man named Schmidt, whose body was found in Vienna under mysterious circumstances many years ago. Schmidt's the one who actually did the work. His friend Gödel somehow got a hold of the manuscript, and it was thereafter attributed to Gödel. Well, in that circumstance, then, when our ordinary man uses the name Gödel, he really refers to Schmidt. Because Schmidt is the unique person satisfying the description, the man who discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic. So since the man who discovered the incompleteness of arithmetic in the scenario is Schmidt, whenever we talk about Gödel, we're in fact talking about Schmidt. But it seems to me that that's not the case. So let's try and unpack it. Given descriptivism, suppose that, again, Schmidt is the one who actually did the famous proof. Well, doing the man who did the famous proof, that seems to be probably the biggest property in the definite description for the name Gödel. And if the referent of this is whoever does the description, then in fact, the referent of Gödel would be this dude who died in an alleyway in Vienna. So every time people thought they were talking about Gödel, they were wrong. They were talking about the dude who died in the alleyway in Vienna. So if they say Gödel spent a lot of time in Princeton, false. Gödel died in Vienna. If they wanted to say Gödel died in a hospital because he refused to eat anything that wasn't cooked by his wife, oh, false. Gödel died in a stabbing in a back alleyway in Vienna.
But that was Schmidt, right?
Yes,
But
because
it's Schmidt's theory that's named after Gödel, it's the same.
yes. So the problem here is that the meaning of Gödel would be this description. The referent would be whoever satisfies the description. So every time that you want to talk about Gödel and use the name Gödel, you don't talk about him. You talk about the dude who died. Another jokey case. Suppose that right after I was born, dubbed Nathan by my parents, I was swapped with another baby. So actually my name's Edward. My real name's Edward. But because of this sort of swap, right, people started calling me Nathan, da 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 da. But importantly, if we think that somehow the description is like what's picked up right at the beginning, all this talk of Nathan is in Tilburg, that's false, and Edward is.
It's far, far.
But importantly, what it's targeted, and it does this beautifully, is the idea that if the meaning of this term is the description, and the referent is the thing that satisfies the description, whatever the hell that might be, a lot of our talk could turn out to be fundamentally wrong. We think we're talking about this weird-looking dude. We are not. Whenever we use Gödel on the hypothetical situation, it's picking out Schmidt. But that just doesn't seem right. When we use Gödel, we're always referring to this man. Do we see the puzzle? It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful trick. So the core of it in this objection is that the meaning of name is going to be some encoded description, and the referent is going to be whatever satisfies the description. The problem, the puzzle, is that the thing that actually satisfies the description might be, if you like, the wrong entity. Yeah.
So the problem with proper names is that they can be empty, and the problem with descriptions is that they're uncertain.
That's kind of the problem, yeah. So the problem with the direct reference theory is we need to have more than mere reference. It seems like we need something else as a kind of intermediate for meaning. The problem with descriptivism, which postulates the kind of most plausible intermediary, is the intermediary sometimes can be fundamentally misleading. Either because of epistemic issues, because of modal issues, or because of semantic issues.
It's epistemic again, isn't it? This last argument.
This isn't epistemic. So this is in particular about the thing that would then be referred to. So we can put it in terms of like, oh, we think we're talking about Gödel, but we're wrong. It's really better to just say, oh, the actual meaning of our expressions, or the actual reference of Gödel would be some other thing entirely.
So couldn't we just semantically fix this kind of uncertainty? So say Gödel from is the guy whom everybody believes that he found.
So one issue with that is, of course, that walks into these problems, right? Because we need to then we need to avoid cases of Joe, who, I don't have a belief about who this is, right? Second thing is, this comes dangerously close to something like this. We already need to know who the referent is in order to know who satisfies the description, but then the mechanism, the kind of the intermediate descriptive thing, isn't doing the work it's supposed to do. It's actually right back to just a tagging theory. This is the trick, right? So, to kind of wrap up, we have these three objections. The epistemic one, the modal one, and the semantic one. All of them raise problems for descriptivism, right? In effect, we have a dilemma, right? And this is close to what you were just saying. We have a dilemma. We have the idea that if we're thinking about proper names, names are just kind of tags, and the semantic content, the meaning of a name is just its referent. And the problem with these is it runs into our four puzzles, right? This stuff we talked about right before the break. Don't really know how to deal with empty names. We don't know how to deal with substitution cases. Crap. On the flip side, you might say, okay, names are encoded descriptions, and reference is then what satisfies the description. But this runs into Kripke's three puzzles. The descriptions can often, or not often, but can separate out from the thing that we're after. It can be misleading. So, crap. If we go names are just tags, problem. If we go that there's this intermediate descriptive thing, problem. Neither option looks completely viable as is, which sucks. And it's very hard to see what we can do. We can modify these positions. Again, I've given them to you in very broad brushstrokes and given the problems to you in very broad brushstrokes. But the nuances that we might play around with these are going to lead to kind of rarefied versions of the problems. This is sort of like we were talking about, right? So it's very hard to see how exactly we can kind of get out of this issue. And just, it's good, because we were talking about, right, incompleteness means mathematicians are never out of a job. This means that semanticists and logicians are never out of a job. It's always nice to want some employment. But the big thing is we know that singular terms refer and have meaning. We just don't still know good answers to our opening questions. Yeah?
Can't you just combine both?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that we kind of talked about these as universal solutions, right? And maybe one of the things we could do is say sometimes proper names work like the million story, sometimes they work in this descriptive way. The problem then is we seem to inherit versions of all of the problems, right? So we need to say, okay, why is it that we can use the descriptive stuff to help when we're in the 4 puzzle cases from the first part and use the non-descriptive stuff to help out in the other cases? It just looks like that's cheating, right?
Yeah.
So we need some kind of external justification for appealing. But that's an option. That is an option. Right? And that's an area where a lot of people have been kind of exploring. Maybe there's a third thing that's lurking here that we haven't really thought about. Maybe we need some kind of different intermediary. It's not descriptions, it's... But exactly what it is and why it's not going to open up more problems, that's another fun thing. So again, the takeaway here, we know they work. And we know they're meaningful, and they refer. They do, they have to, because we use them all the time. But the answers to our opening questions about how they refer and what their meanings are, still up for debate, which is cool. That's fun. Okay, so that's it for today. What I'd like to do, so next time, our last proper meeting, we're going to talk about identity, right? So there's 2 readings for next time. There's 2 very, very, very brief sections from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on identity. It's like 500 words, 600 words, I think, for those 2 sections. And then there's a paper by Max Black on the identity of indiscernibles. So we'll talk about identity next week. It's kind of bringing together some of the stuff we've done today and some of the property stuff we did last week. And that will be the last kind of contentful lecture we'll have. I know. And then from then, the last lecture is just going to be review. So, cool. Thank you guys for coming. Have a lovely, lovely rest of the week. And we'll see you all, I guess, on Friday.